For decades, the UFO story has been told through American eyes. Roswell, Project Blue Book, the CIA, the Pentagon, Arrow, congressional hearings, Navy pilots, military videos, black budgets, classified programs, Kona Blue. But if the phenomenon is real as a global mystery, then it cannot only belong to the United States. It should appear across borders, across cultures, across political systems, across military alliances, and across scientific communities, across nations that did not share the same media, the same ideology, or the same public conversation. And that brings us to one of the most important places in UFO history, the Soviet Union, a closed society, a nuclear superpower, a space power, a scientific state, a military rival, a country with restricted media, powerful intelligence services, secret weapons ranges, classified space programs, and a public record shaped by censorship, ideology, and state control. If UFOs were being reported in the West, what was happening behind the Iron Curtain? Were Soviet citizens seeing the same kinds of unexplained aerial phenomena? Were Russian scientists quietly discussing them? Did the Soviet military treat them as possible aircraft, weapons, atmospheric events, or something else? And did the CIA watch Soviet UFO interests not because it believed in aliens, but because it feared the phenomenon might hide a Soviet technology, a psychological warfare strategy, or a gap in Western intelligence? This is the beginning of a new journey for UFO to UAP Explained, an 8-part mini-series called International UAP Sightings. For the next 8 episodes, we're moving beyond the usual American disclosure story. We will investigate Russian UAP encounters, Brazilian UFO cases, French UFO files, Belgian triangles, Japanese sightings, international military reports, global secrecy, and the question of whether space programs around the world concealed more than they admitted. And we begin where secrecy, silence, intelligence, and the unknown all collide, behind the Iron Curtain. Welcome to UFO to UAP Explained. I'm your host Matt Tones, and today we investigate international UAP sightings, Russian UAP encounters, Soviet UFO files, and the mystery behind the Iron Curtain. Let's begin. The Soviet UFO story is difficult to tell because it is not one story. It is several stories layered together. There is the story of ordinary people seeing strange lights. There is the story of Soviet scientists discussing whether those lights were real, misidentified, or misunderstood. There is the story of US intelligence trying to determine whether Soviet research into UFOs mattered. There is the story of secret weapons ranges, missile tests, satellite launches, and space programs that could create aerial phenomena misidentified by the public. There is the story of official silence, and then there is the deeper question. What happens to a mystery when it appears inside a society built around state secrecy? In the United States, UFO reports became public culture. Newspapers printed flying saucer headlines. Books were written. Witnesses spoke out. Civilian groups formed. Government programs became controversial. The subject turned into a public argument. But in the Soviet Union, the information environment was difficult. The press was controlled. Scientific authority mattered. Military secrecy was intense. Space launches, missile tests, weapons programs, and failures could be concealed or reframed. So the absence of public Soviet UFO noise does not necessarily mean the absence of Soviet UFO reports. It may mean the reports move through different channels: scientific conversations, intelligence summaries, military archives, private discussions, rumor, suppression, or simply silence. That is why the Soviet files are so interesting. They do not give us a clean answer, they give us a controlled glimpse. One of the most important documents for this episode is a CIA report from 1967 titled Report on Conversations with Soviet Scientists on Subjects of Unidentified Flying Objects in the USSR. The report was based on conversations during a trip to the Soviet Union by a US astrophysicist. The aim was to quietly assess Soviet scientific thinking on UFOs during visits to astronomical institutions. That framing is important. This was not a tabloid investigation. It was not a public UFO debate. It was US intelligence trying to understand whether Soviet scientists were seeing, discussing, dismissing, or studying the same problem. And the picture that emerges is not simple. Some Soviet scientists showed very little interest. Some had heard of sightings. Some had seen unusual objects themselves. Some interpreted reports as satellite or rocket debris. Some were skeptical. Others were curious. Some thought the issue remained open. But the report's most revealing conclusion was not that the USSR had solved the UFO mystery, it was almost the opposite. The general feeling recorded in the report was that no official treatment of the UFO problem had been given in the USSR. Yet among Soviet astronomers, there was wide awareness of the history and characteristics of the phenomenon, often accompanied by considerable private interest. That tells us something powerful. Officially, the subject may have been quiet. Privately, it was not absent. Question for you. If a country has strict state control over media and science, does a lack of public UFO reporting make sightings less likely or simply harder to see from the outside? Drop your answer in the comments, and please subscribe and share the episode. Now, let's move through some of the Soviet scientific conversation. The Sternberg Institute in Moscow, the CIA source spoke with a scientist who served as a translator during a discussion on UFOs. The scientist listened, but made clear that if sightings were happening inside the USSR and were being discussed only in the United States, then they might have a Soviet origin. That is a very Cold War way of thinking. Not are UFOs alien, but could they be ours? Could they be theirs? Could there be technology? Could they be misread intelligence signals? That is one reason UFOs mattered during the Cold War. They were not only unexplained objects, they were possible indicators of hidden capability. At the Pulkovo Observatory in Leningrad, an astronomer mentioned hearing about sightings of unidentified objects near the Caucasus, but no study had been made because the observatory was overloaded. That detail is revealing. Not every mystery becomes a program. Not every report becomes a file. Not every scientist has time, funding, permission, or institutional support to investigate. Sometimes a case remains unknown not because it is extraordinary, but because no one has the structure to study it properly. That theme runs through the entire UFO and UAP history. The unknown often survives in the gap between observation and investigation. Now, one of the most fascinating figures in this Soviet file is Nikolai Kozyrev. Kozyrev was an astronomer and a controversial scientific figure. The CIA report says he had read a translated copy of Donald Menzel's book but did not accept its conclusions. Kozyrev reportedly knew of sightings in northern parts of the USSR but said they were not printed in Soviet newspapers because they were not regarded as scientific observations. That line matters. It shows how a phenomenon can be excluded before it is studied. If a report is not considered scientific, it may not be published. If it is not published, it may not be analyzed. If it is not analyzed, it may not become part of the official record. And if it does not enter the record, later generations may assume nothing happened. This is one of the biggest challenges in international UAP research. Different countries do not only have different sightings, they have different systems for deciding what counts as evidence. Kozyrev also raises a broader issue. The Soviet scientific world contained both serious research and fringe speculation, just as the West did. A scientist could be respected in one area and controversial in another. A sighting could be interesting and still not meet scientific standards. A report could be dismissed because it came through the wrong channel. That is why we need to be careful. Soviet UFO files do not automatically confirm extraordinary events, but they do show that the issue existed within serious scientific circles. It was discussed, it was questioned, it was sometimes dismissed, but it was not invisible. Now, at the main astronomical observatory in Kiev, the report says there was little interest in the UFO question. But one scientist, I.K. Koval, mentioned that he and other astronomers had once observed a curious reddish object flashing through the sky. They were convinced it was neither a satellite nor a meteorite, but their immediate interpretation was that it might have been a fragment of a satellite or a rocket re-entering and burning up in the atmosphere. That is the kind of detail that makes this file valuable, because it shows scientists doing what scientists should do. They see something unusual. They compare it against known categories. They do not immediately jump to aliens. They consider satellite or rocket debris. But Koval also believed UFOs had been seen in the USSR, even though he could not provide specific locations and characteristics. That creates a familiar tension. A scientist may believe the broader phenomenon is real, but belief without specific data is not proof. This is one of the reoccurring lessons of the Soviet material. Interest is not evidence, rumor is not evidence, a scientist's opinion is not evidence. But the fact that trained observers were having these conversations matters. It shows that the phenomenon crossed borders. It existed inside Soviet scientific awareness, and it was not simply an American cultural product. At the Crimean Astrophysical Observatory, another astronomer reportedly confirmed Koval's observation of a peculiar object. The CIA report says he did not discuss the experience in detail, but had clearly been struck by the possibility that the object may have been a saucer. That word matters because it shows the vocabulary of the Western UFO debate had crossed into Soviet scientific conversation. Even when scientists were cautious, the imagery and possibility existed. At the Astrophysical Institute in Alma-Ata, now Almaty in Kazakhstan, the report says there was considerable interest. The institute included an atmospheric optics section, which is important because many UFO cases sit directly at the boundary between astronomy, atmosphere, light, perception, and misidentification. One scientist there, G. Idlis, had also read Menzel's book. The report says he considered it an adequate treatment of the subject, but felt the question was closed too quickly. That is a powerful line, not because it proves UFOs are extraordinary, but because it shows a scientist resisting premature closure. That may be one of the healthiest positions in UAP research. Not belief, not dismissal, but the evidence is not enough to close the question. Idlis reportedly said no UFO observations had been made by his staff and that they had received no reports of such observations. But when the US scientists described the results of critical study, Idlis conceded there might be more to the issue and concluded that it was clearly still an open question. That is the tone this subject deserves. Open but not proven, interesting but not confirmed, worth study but not mythologized. Question for you. Do you trust a UFO case more when scientists say we do not know, rather than forcing either belief or dismissal? Tell me your thoughts in the comments. Now, the Soviet file also contains a useful example of explanation. Another astronomer mentioned repeated sightings of ball lightning in northern Kazakhstan. A university team at Alma-Ata investigated and reportedly found that what was being seen were reflections of automobile headlights from an inversion layer. That is exactly why scientific investigation matters. Some strange reports will be explained. Some unknowns will become known. Some lights in the sky will turn out to be atmospheric optics, reflections, spacecraft debris, aircraft, satellites, meteors, balloons, or ordinary things seen under unusual conditions. That is not failure, that is progress. If every case stays mysterious, the field is not investigating properly. The purpose of UAP research is not to preserve mystery, it is to reduce uncertainty. And if a Soviet scientific team could explain repeated reports through headlight reflections and atmospheric inversion, that belongs in the story. Because international UAP research should not only collect the strangest claims, it should also show how countries explain them. But explanations does not erase the entire category, it just sharpens it. Once you remove the reflections, the rockets, the re-entries, the atmospheric effects, and the rumors, what remains? That is the real question. Now let's move to one of the most interesting Soviet-related cases in the files, the Sari-Shagan weapons testing range. Sari-Shagan was a major Soviet test site in Kazakhstan associated with missile defense and strategic weapons development. The CIA intelligence report on Sari-Shagan is not primarily a UFO document, and that is important. Most of the report concerns facilities, work areas, security fencing, regional headquarters, missile warhead checkout units, anti-missile systems, and rumors of laser research. But buried inside that technical intelligence report is an unidentified aerial phenomenon. According to the report, one evening in late summer of 1973, a former Soviet citizen who had worked around the range stepped outside while watching a televised sports competition between Canada and the USSR. He saw a bright green circular object or mass in the sky west of Site 7. The sighting angle was estimated at approximately 70 degrees. There were no clouds in the sky. The object's altitude was undetermined. Within 10 to 15 seconds, the green circle widened. Then, several green concentric circles formed around the mass. Within minutes, the coloring disappeared. There was no sound, no explosion, no rumor afterward. No further details. That case is fascinating because it has layers. A weapons test range, possible laser research rumors elsewhere in the report, a green circular aerial phenomenon, concentric rings, no sound, no cloud cover, a witness with access to a sensitive Soviet environment, and US intelligence capturing the account as part of a broader technical report. Again, this is not proof of non-human technology. It is not proof of a Soviet weapon. It is not proof of a UAP in the modern sense. But it is exactly the kind of historical international case that deserves careful analysis because it shows an unidentified aerial event inside a place where ordinary civilian explanations are not enough by themselves. At Sari-Shagan, the sky was not just sky. It was military test space, missiles, radar, experiments, possibly lasers, strategic defense, secrecy. And in that environment, a strange green expanding ring becomes more than a sighting. It becomes an intelligence question. Was it a test? Was it an atmospheric effect? Was it related to missile or radar activity? Was it a rocket event? Was it something generated by classified Soviet technology? Was it misinterpreted? Or was it still simply unknown? The report does not tell us, and that is the point. The Soviet UAP story is not a clean catalogue of alien encounters. It is an archive of uncertainty inside a closed military scientific state. Question for you. What do you make of the Sari-Shagan green ring case? Secret Soviet technology, atmospheric optics, missile range activity, or a genuinely unresolved UAP? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Now, let's step back. Why was the CIA interested in Soviet UFOs at all? The question is not because the CIA was chasing flyer saucers as entertainment. The answer is that UFOs sat inside the Cold War intelligence problem. In 1953, the CIA Scientific Advisory Panel on Unidentified Flying Objects considered whether the phenomenon posed a national security threat. One concern was whether foreign adversaries could exploit UFO reports, clog communication channels, create public fear, or hide real hostile activity among false alarms. But there was another concern. Could the Soviet Union be involved? Could the USSR create and control something being reported as flying saucers? Could the phenomenon reflect Soviet scientific capability? Could UFO reports be a psychological warfare tool? The panel material does not conclude that flying saucers were Soviet created or Soviet controlled, but it does show that US intelligence considered Soviet capability and Soviet intent as part of the question. That is crucial. For American intelligence, the UFO issue was not only about whether visitors from elsewhere existed, it was about strategic uncertainty. If something unknown appears in the sky and it's not yours, you have to ask whether it belongs to your rival. That logic shaped much of the early UFO response, and it makes the Soviet side of the story essential. Because during the Cold War, every unexplained aerial phenomenon existed inside a military and ideological confrontation. A strange object was not just strange, it could be a weapon, a decoy, a reconnaissance platform, a psychological tool, a misidentified test, a propaganda opportunity, a sign of scientific capability, or a natural phenomenon distorted by fear. That is why this first episode of International UAP Sightings begin with Russia and the Soviet Union. The Soviet UFO question is not simply what did people see? It is how does a superpower interpret the unknown when secrecy is normal, science is political, and the sky is militarized? That question still matters today. Now let's talk about silence. One of the biggest mistakes in UFO research is treating public visibility as the same thing as event frequency. The United States has a huge public UFO record partly because it has a media culture, a civilian research culture, freedom of information processes, congressional hearings, public witnesses, commercial broadcasting, podcasts, books, and lawsuits. That does not mean the phenomenon happens more often in the United States. It means the American system produces more public noise. In the Soviet Union, a sighting might never become a newspaper story. A military case might never become public. A scientific discussion might stay inside an institute. A missile test might be officially described as something else. A failed launch might be concealed. A citizen might not trust authorities enough to report, or authorities might not want the report to circulate. This does not put a hidden Soviet UFO archive full of extraordinary cases, but it does mean we should not equate silence with absence. The Iron Curtain did not only hide politics, it hid data. That is why international UAP work is so important. It forces us to ask how each country's political system shaped the record. In open societies, the problem may be noise. Too many reports, too many hoaxes, too much media amplification, too much speculation. In closed societies, the problem may be silence. Too few public records, suppressed reports, restricted archives, state control, incomplete release. Both systems distort the truth, one through access, the other through absence. And the UAP researcher has to navigate both. Now let's consider the phrase Russian UAP encounters. Modern listeners might expect dramatic cases, hovering craft, pilots, radar locks, military chases, and secret files. Some of those stories exist in public UFO literature, but this episode is starting with a stronger foundation: declassified intelligence records. Why? Because your show is not built on unsupported mythology. It's built on evidence. The CIA conversations with Soviet scientists show that Soviet astronomers had heard of sightings, discussed them, and in some cases observed unusual phenomena. The Sari-Shagan report shows that an unusual green aerial event was captured in a U.S. intelligence report about a Soviet weapons range. The CIA advisory materials show that U.S. officials considered Soviet involvement and capability as part of the UFO question. Those three pieces gives us a serious foundation. Not enough to claim a hidden extraterrestrial Soviet file, enough to say that Soviet UAP problem was real as an intelligence subject, and that is the story. Not Russia had aliens, not the CIA proved Soviet sources, not every strange light was a weapons test. The stronger claim is UFOs were discussed, observed, investigated, dismissed, and worried over inside the Cold War intelligence environment, including in relation to Soviet science and military capability. That is a serious episode. Now, where does this leave us? It leaves us with a more complicated global picture. UFOs were not just American folklore. They crossed borders. They appeared in Soviet conversations. They entered CIA reporting. They appeared near scientific institutions. They appeared in relation to a weapons range. They were considered in the context of Soviet capability. They were sometimes explained, sometimes dismissed, sometimes left open. That is exactly what we should expect if UAP are a global category rather than a national myth. But it also teaches humility, because the Soviet record is incomplete. A closed society does not give us clean data. A CIA report does not give us the full Soviet archive. A conversation with astronomers does not tell us what the Soviet military knew. A sighting at a weapons range does not identify itself. So the correct response is not certainty, it is investigation. That is the foundation of this miniseries. Every country has a different relationship with the unknown. Brazil responded publicly in some cases. France built formal investigation structures. Belgium had a famous triangle wave. Japan has a quieter but fascinating history. Russia and the Soviet Union filtered the UFO question through secrecy, science, ideology, and military competition. Together, those international cases will help answer a bigger question. Is UAP a global phenomenon or a global pattern of how humans misread the sky? That is the question this series will explore. Question for you. Does the Soviet UFO record make the UAP mystery feel more credible because it crosses borders, or more complicated because every country controls information differently? Tell me in the comments. Now, before we close, let's bring the first episode back to the central theme. The mystery behind the Iron Curtain was not simply whether Soviet citizens saw strange things. They did. The mystery is what happened after. Who recorded the sighting? Who dismissed it? Who studied it? Who suppressed it? Who connected it to military activity? Who wondered whether it was foreign technology? Who considered it atmospheric optics? Who filed it away? And who still has records we're yet to see? That is the hidden architecture of international UAP research, not just sightings, systems. Every government has a system for managing the unexplained. Some systems are scientific, some are military, some secret, some are bureaucratic, and some are dismissive. Some are public, some are silent. And the Soviet system was one of the most secretive in modern history. That is why this story matters, because if UAP are truly global, then the American file is only one chapter. The Russian file is another. The Brazilian file is another. The French file is another. The Japanese file is another. The global secrecy file is another. And only when we compare them do we begin to understand the phenomenon itself. Final question for you. Which international UAP country do you think deserves the most serious investigation? Russia, Brazil, France, Japan, Belgium, Chile, Australia, or somewhere else? Leave your answer in the comments. This has been UFO to UAP Explained. I'm your host, Matt Tones. If you found this episode valuable, follow the show and share it with someone interested in international UAP sightings, Russian UFO encounters, Soviet secrecy, CIA files, Cold War intelligence, and the global mystery of unidentified aerial phenomena. This is only episode 1 of 8 in the International UAP Sightings miniseries. Next, we continue beyond the American disclosure story and into another country where official UFO records, public sightings, and government response created one of the most compelling international cases in the world. And remember, the unknown does not respect borders, but governments do. And sometimes the real mystery is not only what happened in the sky, it is what each nation chose to do with the report.